macro here. Just highlight it and release. And then it shows us a list of the macros. And you will see here, julienne.lwm. Select it, hit OK. And now when we go back to the macro list, hey, there's the julienne macro. Now if you want to save this macro as part of your list permanently, all you have to do is go up to the top where it says Configure List. And then you see it says Macro List, Load, Save, Clear. Just hit Save. Give it the same name. And basically we've now saved the macro list over itself with julienne as part of it. And what you'll see is, we go back to Layout, if we shut down Modeler, restart it up, next time we come back in, there's julienne right there. So this is the quickest way to add these macros, and again, there's a couple of them that are just completely hidden from you. Now julienne is incredibly useful. Let me show you how it would work. We will load up the PopCan again. And rather than go through all the steps that we had to go through before, all we do is we pick these center polygons. And then we want to split it into more divisions top to bottom. Now, the julienne macro, when you run it, it only has a couple of settings here. One of them is axis, one of them is number of divisions. We're going on the y-axis. We want to split it up like this, top to bottom. So we pick y-axis. How many divisions? 20 looks pretty good to me. So we hit OK. Then you wait a couple seconds. And what it's doing is it's going through all the work we had to do before, pulling out the polygons and resegmenting it. But it's a lot easier and quicker. There you go. Done deal. That was real time, by the way. Go to the bend function, click and drag. You see the bend works a little bit better. This is an example of an extremely simple macro, but the point we're bringing here is that there are some macros that are hidden from you, you do not see normally. You can easily add them to your list. By the way, let's say you decide that you might not, need the haiku macro all that often, so you don't need that as part of the regular list. How do you do that? Just go back to Configure List, pick the old haiku macro, and then then hit Delete. Then hit Save List. And OK. No more haiku. Has it erased it from the disk? No, not at all. What the list is really, it's a referent to the file. It's just saying, make this visible as part of the regular list. It doesn't erase it from the computer at all. In fact, if you decide a few weeks later you really need the haiku macro, you can go back, and it's still right there. Just do the add macro, and it will come right back to you. So by using the add macro and the configure list function, you can go in and make a nice, clean, lean list that just has the functions that you want on it. Now let's go through and show you a few more of these functions, because there's a number of macros that I think are interesting and kind of helpful for setting up some things. And let's actually start just by adding a couple of macros here that might not be on your list. First one is called Light Swarm. Do an add macro to add that. Next one we're going to add is called pclone. And finally, we're going to add one also down the list called prick. No jokes, okay? Light Swarm, Particle Clone, pclone, and prick, all with .lwm after them. And these show up on the menu as Light Swarm. Light Swarm actually just called Light Swarm. Pclone is Particle Clone, and prick is called Random Surface Points. And we'll be using these a little bit later. But let's just add those now to get that out of the way. And just go in, configure list, and save the old list. By the way, one other thing you can do up here is you can configure your keys, which means if there's a macro that you like quite a bit, for instance, julienne, let's say you decide you want to use that often, just go here into the F10 key, click on the far right button there, then choose the julienne macro, or whatever one you want. It doesn't even have to be part of your list. Now you'll see that the F10 key is julienne assigned to it. So now whenever I want to run julienne, I just hit the F10 key. Pretty darn simple. Okay, from here, let's continue on. And let me clear out what we've got here. I'm going to use the Z keyboard shortcut to get rid of this. Z's delete. And let's just start by loading the Porsche object. And the first problem that we want to solve here, and notice the Porsche object is fairly big, it takes a little while to load. The first actual problem we want to solve here is, hit the A key to fill this in, is that sometimes you have big objects. And when you're trying to set up a scene with an object like this, particularly if you've got a bunch of objects like this, it becomes very cumbersome. So one option is to use a stand-in object. And you can make a stand-in by using a macro called bounding box up at the very top. What bounding box does, and you just select it, hit OK here, and it actually tells you what to do. It says undo to remove original object. Is you run bounding box, and it creates a 6-sided box that is exactly the same size as the perimeters of the object. So notice we now have a box here that exactly meshes with the object sides. Then you hit the undo button, leaving you with just the box. And here's your stand-in. What you do is you would save this object as Porsche stand-in. I would quit the program. And now what I could do is I'll just clear out this scene. I could load up the stand-in object and just use this in the interim, just use this in the meantime until I get the scene set up. So I get this running. Anything I can do with the regular Porsche I could do with this. Let me actually turn it around. Well, actually, this will be fine like this. Start it here at 0, then up here at 30, and then at 15 we'll just have it back here a little bit. Let's also just go to the motion graph real quickly and give it an aligned path. And you'll notice that since this object is just a bounding box, previews and everything else render extremely quickly. And I can get a good idea of what the motion is going to be like. Then when I want to actually use the object, go to the Objects menu, hit Replace, and just select the original one. And it's going to replace the actual Porsche right there. And so again, you'll see making a preview takes a little bit more time here, but we don't really need to now. We test it with the stand-in. So this is one way to use that bounding box macro. It's pretty handy. Now, let's start to use a couple of the other macros that we've worked with here. And first one I want to work with is point distributions. And this is going to actually lead us into a number of other macros. What point distributions does is it randomly creates a bunch of points, as many as you select up here at the top. And it distributes those points either in a round shape, a square shape. You can change fall-off settings, but I'm just going to leave it at the default settings, a radius of 1 by 1 by 1 meter. And I'll have it generate 50 points. Hit OK. And it's just going through here, making them. There we go. Hit OK. And here's just a bunch of points. So what are we going to do with a bunch of points? Well, a number of things, actually. This will actually create particle systems. These single-point objects are particles, and they're used as stars, for instance. They're also used for sparks coming off of fire. There's a lot of stuff you can do with particle things, but a lot of people are hesitant to get into it because they hear you have to do a lot of heavy programming and stuff like that. I want to show you a couple of real simple things you can do with particles just to get you started and show you how these macros function. The first thing I'm going to do is we've done a point distribution, but these won't be visible because they're just points right now. Now, if we want to make these points visible, there's another macro called points to polys. And what points to polys does, and you can assign any surface name you want, is it will go through and make each point a single point polygon or a visible particle. This way you will just see the point, and I will name this stars, or I can name it anything. I'll name it stars. This is just a surface name. Now I will save this object as particles. Quit out. Clear out our scene here. Load up the particles object. And now when I do a render, what you'll see is this renders up. I'm just hitting the F9 key to render. Here's the way these load up. Visible single-point particles. Now they're right in the middle of the screen. One thing you might want to do is take the whole box and move it a little bit closer to the camera. And in fact, if you wanted to, you could actually animate this so the whole thing moves towards you. You could create a whole long row of these and have it move towards you. And what you're going to get is, let me just show you this real quickly here, is here at 0, then at 30, we will have it have moved forward some. Let me make a preview here. You see the little points kind of moving towards you. You end up with the sort of science fiction effect of stars moving towards you. And because particles are just single points, they never get any bigger. If you can move them right up to the camera, they never change inside. Now, this is one use for them. Let me show you something that's so easy and yet easy and kind of impressive looking that I can't pass up showing it to you. It's a way to take a bunch of particles and get them to animate individually, so each point is moving around. And the example we're going to show you here is a way to do bugs, for instance. If you want to make these look like particles like a swarm of mosquitoes, we can do it. But as you'll see, we could also do the same thing with sparks or anything we want. And this is, again, just ridiculously easy. What we do is we take the bunch of points here. Let me just move it at 0 so they're just back out here. And so I've set it, I got rid of the keyframe at 30. And right now, if we make a preview, it's just the points sitting there. They're not doing anything. All right. So let's go up and make this a 90-frame scene. And the idea here is we're going to use a function, displacement mapping. And we actually have a tape where we discuss displacement mapping. Just a quick refresher or reminder or introduction to displacement mapping, depending upon where you are. Displacement mapping actually moves polygons around. It's like bump mapping, but it actually moves polygons. And you can use it to get a flag waving or water rippling, anything like that. Well, we're going to actually use displacement mapping on these points. What you do is, we got the object called particles. Go to the objects menu. Make sure you've got that chosen. And let me just warn you now, this goes real quickly, so pay attention. There's no trick here. Here's what we do. You hit displacement mapping. Choose ripples. We're pretty much done. By selecting ripples now, it's going to ripple these points around, and they're going to move almost like flies buzzing around. Now, the only thing we might want to change, and the only thing I would change here, is that the wave speed is too high. Instead of 0.025, I'll make it 0.002. Hit Use Texture. And now let's just make a preview. And while it's making the preview, just remember the way this is going to work is it's actually moving the points around in this pattern. So when we watch the preview, you'll see that these things look like they're actually animating. And if you pick one and watch it, it kind of looks like it's moving around like a bug, and the whole thing moves around that way. Now, if we were to actually change the wave speed on this, go up to Objects, Displacement Map, let's say 0.02, which is about where it was before, all you'll see is that these are now angry bugs. They're just moving around much quicker. And this could be used to do, for instance, the look of snow being shaken up in one of those little attractive glass tourist-like things where you shake it up, snow flies, or sparks coming off of something. There's a lot of different uses for this, but again, we're just using displacement map with this, and it's a real quick, easy trick here. Okay, now we got a couple other uses for the points here, so let's go back into Modeler, and we're going to see another macro that's kind of neat here, which is called Light Swarm. Cleared out the particles that we had. Let's just generate point distributions one more time. And I'm only going to generate 15 points this time. And again, it does scatter them out in this random order. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to come back to this. We'll hold on to this for a second. I'm going to run a macro called Light Swarm. And let me just give you an example of how you would use it in a sort of normal setting. We will save this. We'll come back and apply Light Swarm to it in just a minute. But let's go to another layer here. And I'm just going to make a simple UFO object, and boy, I mean simple. It's just a disk. There's my UFO. Okay. Again, the object here is kind of irrelevant. Pretend this is the best looking UFO you've ever seen. The idea is, let's say I want this UFO to have a ring of, for instance, lights around the bottom of it. Well, what we do is, otherwise we'd have to go and load the UFO up, position the lights by hand, and it would be no fun at all. Instead, what we do is we can go in and select where we want these lights to be on a point-by-point basis. So I want lights to be here, 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 and down here. And you also selected the top and bottom points. I'm going to use the lasso, the right mouse button, to deselect the top here. So we just have 6 points selected along the bottom. Okay. That's it. Any questions there? Pretty straightforward. Now, all we do is we run the Light Swarm macro. And there's a little tricky part to this macro because there's actually two functions. One that you do here in Modeler, another one that you do in Lightwave. Run Light Swarm. And what it's doing is it's coming up and giving you the requester that's asking you to save a scene. And you have to give this a name, and I'll call this UFO. And then it's coming up and it's giving you a bunch of light attributes. Now this panel here are attributes for the lights that the light swarm macro creates. And you can go and set these attributes up any way you want to. So I will make these point lights. I will make them 50% intense. I will make them red. Now these colors here are RGB in order. No fall off. I'll leave that alone, by the way. RGB. So if I go to R255, green 0, blue 0, I'll make them lens flare lights with a 25% lens flare intensity. Shadow casting would mean that these lights cast shadows. Outer glow lights will actually create a second light at every point. I'm going to turn that off. It's a neat effect sometimes, but I don't want that neat effect right now. Hit OK. There it is. It's done. And what it's done is it's created a scene file in the RAM disk. That's where it goes by default, called UFO. Now let's save our UFO object here. Exit out to Lightwave. Clear out everything we got here, just so we're starting from scratch. Load up the old UFO object. And now under Object Still, do a load from scene. Go to your RAM disk. Just type in the word RAM : Again, if you haven't changed your Lightwave config file, you probably still have a RAM disk button there, but this is the only time I ever use the RAM disk in Modeler, so unless you get really addicted to Lightswarm, don't use it. You notice there's UFO. Double-click on it to load it up. And it says load lights from scene as well as objects. You definitely want to hit yes there. This is the whole point. We're loading lights. There's no point if you don't load lights. So hit yes. And then in 3.1, it's going to come up with a little error message telling you that it can't find a null object. Do you wish to select an alternative object? And the problem is it's looking for an object called null object, but the 3.1 software deletes the object called null object. But if we tell it not to select an alternate object, if we hit no here, what it's going to do is, this is what happened in any scene. If you tell it don't select an alternate object, it replaces the object with a null object. Therefore, just say no. That's the sort of moral of this story. When this comes up and says can't find null object, select an alternate object, just hit no, and it will replace the null object with a null object. And that's what it does. So now we have two objects. We have one object in the scene, the null object and the UFO here, both of these. And what you'll see is, here's our UFO. And under Options, I'm going to go to Show Lights. I'm going to go to the top view. And there are the lights positioned exactly where we wanted on the UFO. Now, if we move the UFO, of course the lights, well, they don't do anything. They're just staying there. And all we have to do here, if we want the lights to move with the UFO, is parent the lights to the UFO. And the way we do that is each light is parented to the null object. So we pick the null object, parent it to UFO, and now wherever we move the UFO, the lights follow. And again, this is very, very handy. So we just move this out here. What you'll see is it's not a spectacular job of object modeling or anything like that. But when we hit the render button, we will have the lights in exactly the positions, and there will be red lights in those 6 positions. So this is a very, very handy way to quickly put lights anywhere you want on an object. You just select the points, then run the light swarm macro. All right, now let's go back and use the light swarm macro with the original object we created. What light swarm is going to do is it's going to give us lights at each of these 15 random points that have been created. So I'm just going to run light swarm here. And I'll just create this as lights. Go ahead and set our light attributes. I'm going to give these lights no intensity whatsoever. But I do want them to have a lens flare. Let's say, it really doesn't make any difference, by the way, for the purposes we're going to do. 30% doesn't matter. And then turn off outer glow light, because again, now you can experiment with this on your own, but what outer glow light would do is it would add 2 lens flares at every point. One with just glow attributes, the other with the light attributes. It can look nice, but not for what I want to do here. So we hit OK. There. Now we will clear out here, clear out the scene completely. And there was no object. You notice I did not save the 15 points. All I was trying to do was throw points up at random and then attach lights to them. Because this actually allows you to do some neat special effects, for instance, fireworks. There's a quick way you could do that. Or little light explosions, stuff like that. And this is very, very handy for logos. Go to Objects, Load from Scene. I'm already at my RAM disk. I load up lights. Remember, load lights, yes. Then just say no. And what this will give us, if we go to Show Lights, is it brings in 15 different lights, all parented to the null object. So let's pick the null object, move it out here in the distance, and let's actually take this, let's just keyframe it there. I just want to get rid of that first light. You notice we've got the first light here that's just the distant. We don't really need that. I'll clear it out. Okay. So we've got all these lights thrown off at random. Now one thing we could do is kind of quickly go in and take each light and change its color a little bit. And again, just use the sliders in here to kind of go and randomly throw in colors. And I'm only going to do this for a couple of them. But you get the idea. I could just go through here. And what I'm doing is I'm using the down arrow key to move to the next light, then hitting light color, changing lights the way I want them to do different color values. So I've done a few of them here. Now, what can we do with these? Well, one kind of neat thing you can do with them happens when you resize the null object. Now, these lights are all parented to the null. And what this means is if I resize, so I go to the size attribute, the null, as we size it bigger, the lights move away from that point. So we size it smaller, they move towards it until when the size is 0, 0, 0, all the lights are in exactly the same place. So let me size it numerically to 0, 0, 0. Move it down here and create a keyframe at frame 0. Then at frame 30, let's say, I will create a keyframe up here and have them be exploded. That's fairly exploded. Let me have them completely exploded. So none of the lights are visible at frame 30. Then at, let's say, frame 20, I will have it be moved up this way. And let's just make a quick preview of this. And what you'll see is the lights start blowing up immediately, which is not as effective as it could be. So one idea is to, at frame 20, or maybe a little before that, and I'm just doing a short little example here, but let's say at frame 15, have them be at this same position on the move, but then be sized to 0. Create a keyframe there. So now from frame 0 to 15, they're going to stay the same size. Then they will suddenly explode at frame 15 through 30. Now, one problem we're going to have here if we make this preview is you're going to see the lights get bigger, then get smaller, then get really bigger. We don't want that. So the problem is, one we've talked about in some of the basic tags, so just to set it up here, is we've got a problem. We need to put on linear on the second keyframe. It's a spline problem. And by putting linear on, now you'll see stays small and explodes. And I might want to do things a little differently, like at 30 it could probably be dropped down a little bit more. But you see the basic idea here. It goes up, explodes, and drops down. Now, if we were to take a quick render of any one of these frames, let's just go somewhere in the middle where we can still see some of the lights. This looks like a fun frame. This will take a little bit of time, so I'm going to go to super low res, and even then it'll take time. We'll just cut to the final frame here. What you're going to see is we have all these lens flares coming off. Well, one thing we could do is envelope them, so there's no light at the beginning, or a very, very dim light. And then when they hit the point where they start to explode, they envelope up, so the flare intensity increases, then goes down very, very quickly. And that's the kind of thing we can do very easily. Here's the way it looks super low res. We actually see the lights pulled away from that point. The way we would do that is just go in, and I'm going to do this for 2 lights, but you can just repeat it for all of them. I go in to the flare options for 1 light. For flare intensity, create an envelope. And I'm going to use the mouse function create here, where I want to start Well, let's just drag this down to 0 first. So I went to mouse function drag. I want to start at 0. Then at frame 15, roughly, it should still be 0. Then it should kind of quickly go up and then fade back down by that point. And I'm just going to go in. I was a little off on some of these, so I just go in and I can drag them. So it should be back off again by 30, let's say. And that's probably a little high. By the way, if you're doing a whole bunch of lights, you don't want the flare intensity to go too high. It goes insane. Here we get the same problem we did before. We have to 2 keyframes in the same position. You need to put on linear. There we go. Now once this is created for one light, I just save this envelope. Light. Then go to the next light, flare options, intensity, load envelope, use envelope. Next one. Same thing. And you see the idea here. I can kind of quickly go through and give all these lights the same envelope. So just another example of the way you could use light swarm. And again, we just set this up in just a few seconds there, but it's the kind of thing you could set up and get a fairly decent look. I've also used light swarm, for instance, to put lights around the sides of letters. So letters actually, and then give the lights themselves sort of an envelope there. So the letters look as though they're flickering on and off like they're lit up by fireworks or something like that. A lot of ways you can play with this macro, but again, a lot of people don't know it's there. And if they do know it's there, they don't know how it works. Okay, finally I want to show you how we use those particle clone and random point distribution macros. Another handy little thing here. And let me just set up a problem. And I'm going to start this time by rendering a landscape. And quickly we can model a landscape here. I'll pull us back out so our grid size is fairly big. I'm dragging out a flat polygon. And I want to make it multi-segmented. So I'll give it, let's say, 25 segments by 25 segments. All right. And I notice that the polygons are facing the wrong way because whenever I draw out a flat polygon in the top view, they always face downward. So I deselect everything, hit the F key. F is the keyboard shortcut for the flip function. It just flips all the polygons so they're now facing upward. And then I'm going to use the magnet tool just to kind of go in and quickly draw out some mountains. And the magnet tool, just as a refresher, the magnet tool, the left mouse button selects basically how big an area we're affecting. The right mouse button drags you up or down. And we'll just go out and drag a little something up in the background. So we've created this little landscape, and let's just make it, right now it's okay, but it's probably a little flat. I mean, it's going up and down, but the individual polygons are still very, very normal. One quick way around that is the jitter function. What jitter does, and keyboard shortcut is Shift-J, or you can find it in the Tools menu under jitter. But Shift-J, it just will randomly throw around points, therefore moving the polygons. And the maximum radius is whatever you set here. So I don't want it to be too big. I guess 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And if I zoom in here a little bit, you see it just kind of randomly throws these around. And this will give our landscape a little bit more of a rough look. Okay, so far so good. Now let's say I want to get fancy with our landscape here. And I want to put trees on it. Have fun. The problem you're going to have, of course, is that putting trees on here, positioning them, very, very hard to do in wireframe. So it's going to be no fun at all. And that's where random surface points and particle clone come in handy. These two macros allow you to add objects, and in this case to a landscape, but really to anything. This is a perfect example for it. Let me take you through, show you how you'd use it. All right, so we select random surface points. This is the way you run it. You select random surface points. Then it says approximate number of points, and believe me, this is pretty approximate. There's a complex way this goes through and works. It's going to basically end up sort of, it's trying to lay it across, and it takes the square root of the number and all kinds of brainiac stuff. What dumb people like me remember is that whatever number you give it, it's going to give you less number of points. So if I give it, for instance, let's say 100 points, it's going to say how many it drew. And if I give it 100 over here, let's just see it actually drew 32 of them. Okay, that works for me. So the idea is now we have 32 points, and you will see that they are put right along the surface of the object. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to generate a tree here, and then we are going to use particle clone to put the tree at these random points. So let's go to another layer, and rather than generating a tree, I'm going to do the smart lazy thing, go to the landscape directory, and I will just load up the coconut tree object that comes with the toaster. And let me just hold down the shift key in the background and select layer 1. I just want to see how the coconut tree compares to the, this is okay. The coconut tree is probably a little big compared to the landscape. It's just the landscape that I created was small compared to the real world. So let's actually go in here and resize the tree down. It'll work a little bit better. And yeah, that works a little bit better. And then let's just take a look at the tree. And I want the tree so it's basically the bottom of the tree is at the 0 point, right like this. But I want the tree centered in other ways. And the quick way to do this is a macro center 1D. This lets you center it in any one dimension. In this case, I want to center it on the x-axis and the z-axis. By the way, the keyboard shortcut for center 1D, unless you've changed your config keys, is the F2 key. So I'll pick Z. There we go. It's nice and centered. Now what I do is I take the layer that's got the random surface points that were created, and I put that in the background. So there they are. Then I run particle clone. Just select particle clone, release. And what it's doing is it's making clones of the trees every place there was a point there in the background. And again, the coconut tree here is a fairly large, substantial object. But what we'll see here in just a couple seconds is something that looks like this. So here are our trees, and if we were to view the ground plane, let's actually hold down Shift and click on the first layer at the top to select that in addition. What you'll see is the trees are going up, going into the valley down here, fitting perfectly. Now, they don't rotate or anything like that. It just lays down the trees straight up. But this is sure a darn sight easier. We could go in now and rotate them individually if we want to. But it's obviously a lot better than trying to position these things by hand. That would, again, it would kill you. You'd never want to do it. So that's the way these macros work, and they're quite handy. Let me give you one other possibility here. Rather than doing trees, let's say you wanted to do the high up in a hill looking down into the lights of the valley sort of thing. What could you do? Well, we've already seen it. You could create random surface points, then use the light swarm macro, and light swarm would throw a light at every random surface point. Then as you look at this ground plane, you would see lights along the ground there. Now, there's obviously, we've scratched the surface of some of this stuff, and the point is go through, look for the macros that are there, and in fact, now that you've kind of seen some of the secret world of the toaster by using show all files and a number of the other settings here, you can go through and actually experiment. Try some of the macros. Try some of the Toaster Paint macros in AREX. Try writing your own keyboard shortcuts. Or just nose around a little bit. It's hard to hurt stuff, although it's possible. So before you start editing files heavily or anything like that, you'd probably do yourself pretty well to make a backup copy of it as we've discussed. Also, don't go around and deleting things at random. Not generally a good idea. Remember, you're on your own. I'm a trained professional. Don't try some of this stuff at home unless you've taken adequate safety measures for your computer. That's all for this tape. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to write to us at the address you see on your screen right now. Until next time, my name is Lee Serenian. Thanks a lot. Bye.